Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are at MCC North Express with Do School students. I want to thank you for joining us for Talk to a Scientist. We are extremely excited today to have Amanda Dwyer join us. She is homegrown from Ralston, Nebraska, and I'm going to read you a little bit of information about her because it is so exciting. So currently, she is living in Maryland. She is a marine scientist. But what I was really excited about when I talked to Amanda is that she always wanted to be a marine scientist, even when she was a little kid, but she never even saw the ocean until she was 20 years old. That's how excited she was about the ocean. So she grew up right here in Ralston, Nebraska, where she first became interested in coral reefs. And after going to college in the Midwest, she got her doctorate by studying coral reefs. And she went to Central America, she went to the Florida Keys, and in addition to conducting scientific research and science communication and connecting science to policy, which is some of her passions, she is currently working with marine debris. So that garbage patch that is traveling all across the world, she is studying that. I'm really excited to talk to her today. She's going to share some of her experiences. And best of all, we have questions from Do School students, and they get to talk directly to a scientist. Amanda, thank you for joining us today.
Just finding the mute button. Thank you, Daphne. I'm really excited. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. I'm really excited to talk with you guys today. I hope you guys are excited as well. All right, we'll just get this sound good. All right, is everyone seeing my slides large? Okay, good. Might be a little lag. Well, thank you, Daphne, for that great introduction. So I'm going to start a little bit just talking about myself and a little bit about my journey, and then we'll talk a little bit about coral reefs and marine debris. So I'm really excited to connect with all of you today. I wanted to start off with this photo because I think it highlights a few different things that I want to talk about today. It shows some of the tools that I work with, but most importantly, something I want to start off with highlighting is that there's a lot of work to being a marine scientist that actually occurs outside of the ocean. So a big bonus is getting to dive and be immersed in that environment. But there's a lot of work on the dry side of things, as we call it. So you can see that I'm processing some samples that I collected after a dive right on the boat, right after I was under the water. And behind me, you can actually see what we call scuba equipment. And that's what we use to be able to breathe underwater while we're doing our work in the ocean. So before I really dive in, I wanted to highlight, as Daphne said, that this all started where you guys are today in Nebraska, far away from any coastlines or even the Great Lakes, any part of the ocean. But there's still so much that you can do to learn about the ocean and be involved in Nebraska. Like Daphne said, I got interested in coral reefs in the first grade by doing a project in my classroom, and I continued to read about them and other ocean animals and ocean environments just to gain that knowledge for myself. And I also volunteered at the aquarium at the zoo to get a little bit of hands-on experience. But even for college, as Daphne said, I still stayed in the Midwest and I went to Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is a little bit closer to the Great Lakes, so a little more water to work with, even though it's not the ocean. And so I was able to get involved in some field work, get out on boats, do sampling, and get some of that hands-on research experience to help me prepare for a career in the marine field. So as Daphne said, I didn't get to go on my first dive into the ocean until I was 20 years old. And so this is a photo of my first dive on a coral reef in the Cayman Islands. So for reference, here's a map. You can see the Cayman Islands here, just outside of the Gulf of Mexico. And so on this dive, I knew I wanted to study coral reefs. Just after getting down, it was a little scary the first time you're diving into the ocean and you take a breath underwater. But I loved it and I was so excited. And so I actually only spent 2 weeks on this reef just as part of a field course for one of my college classes. But just with those 2 weeks of experience on coral reefs, I was still able to apply and go to grad school to focus on studying coral reefs. And when I was your age, I didn't even know that grad school was a thing. I had no idea what it was. So grad school is an opportunity after you finish college to really specialize in a field that you're interested in. So you might get a master's degree or a doctorate degree, and then that will really help others know that you're an expert and you're a leader in that field. And this might be something that you do after college right away, or it might be something where you get a job and you figure out more of what you're really interested in and what you want to specialize in. So I was really lucky that for my first year of grad school, I got to work with my advisor, Dr. Mark Patterson from Northeastern University, and I got to travel with him to the Aquarius Underwater Research Station. And this is located just off the Florida Keys. And so when you look at this photo, you can really see that this research station is actually becoming a part of the reef. There's things growing on it, there's things living all around it. And for context, it's about the size of a school bus. So there's about 6 people who could be living in this research station at a time. And stations like this are very valuable because for a variety of reasons, when you're diving, you can't stay underwater for very long. At the reef where this station is located, you can't stay down for much more than an hour. So in this station, some lucky scientists or ocean supporters can actually live underwater for days at a time inside of this station. And they can get a lot more work done and they can have some really cool experiences. So I didn't actually get to live inside the station, but I got to visit it on a few dives. So I want to share a little bit more about not even all, but some of the things that you do as a marine scientist. So we mentioned the diving, we mentioned the processing the samples on the boat. There's also quite a bit of lab work depending on your process. So you spend a lot of time in the lab. For me, I spent a lot of time on the microscope. So this is a photo of me looking at my samples under the microscope. But then once you finish with your samples, you have to spend some time on the computer looking at your data and figuring out the answers that you were trying to find, and then sharing that with others. Another part for me of being a marine scientist is being what we like to call a jack of all trades. So all of my field work was done on an island, and there's no Home Depot and there's no Lowe's there. So anything that I forgot or anything that broke or anything that came up, I had to figure out how to create it myself. So this is me doing some power tool work, trying to create something that I needed to use underwater. Another really important aspect is science communication. So a lot of times scientists share their findings in an article by writing it up, but it's really important that our work as scientists is shared broadly with the community. And there's a lot of different ways that can be done. This is me sharing some of my research at a conference with a poster, so it's a bit more visual. And I also brought along some tools to share a 3D experience to kind of help people who aren't necessarily as familiar with the work I'm doing be able to relate to it more. But there's lots of different ways to communicate science. So if you're interested in the ocean, you don't necessarily have to go down the science path. You might be someone who really is involved in sharing the science that other people are doing. And then also there's policy, as Daphne mentioned. So this is a photo of me when I was living in Massachusetts, and I was speaking at a hearing about a plastic bag ban for the state of Massachusetts, and sharing some of the knowledge that I knew and some of the science that I had learned to share my perspective about this. So, so that's kind of how you can be involved in science and policy. So there's lots of different ways, and this is just a few examples of what you might be doing as a marine scientist. So that was a brief background on what my path was, but let's take and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, but let's take some time to dive into learning about coral reefs right now for a little bit. So this is a photo that I took when I was diving off the coast of Panama, so in Central America, really close to South America. And you can notice all the different colors and shapes and sizes of what we see on this reef. So I also am going to try, hopefully it works, to try to make this presentation a little bit interactive. So I have a few questions, about 5 questions throughout. So if anyone has a device that can connect to the internet, you can type in this code. So you can go to vevox.app, which is vevox.app. And then you can type in the number 146520852. And this is my first time trying this out, so I hope that it works. So my first question is just a poll, and it's a bit of a tricky question. But since we're starting off with corals, I wondered if you guys think a coral is an animal, a plant, or a rock. So we'll go ahead and look at these answers. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to try to get logged in and think about what you want to pick as your answer. And as you're doing that, I just want to preface that for all of these questions, it doesn't matter if you don't know the answer, because as a scientist, that's a lot of what we do. And I bet there's going to be someone who asks a question today that I don't know the answer to either. And so today we can all practice being scientists and just taking in information and learning it for the future. So I'm going to go ahead and see what our results are showing right now. And it looks like a lot of people have said animal and a few people have said plant. So that's great. I put rock in because it can be tricky. They look like rocks. They don't look like they're moving around, but they are actually animals. So what you can see is that these, when we look at this photo, we can see these kind of circles, or you might call them stars. And those are what we call polyps. And those individual polyps are what make up the coral colony. And those coral polyps, you can't see it now because this photo isn't showing it, but that's how a coral animal actually eats. So those polyps can open up and tentacles can come out and they can grab food from the water column for the corals to eat. But those of you that said plant are also really close, because corals have a really special relationship with these tiny plants. We call them algae. The tiny plants in the water are called algae. There's one specific type of algae that live inside the corals, and they're really special for the corals. They have a good relationship because the corals give them a nice, safe place to live, and the algae gives the corals energy and food. So in this photo, what we're looking at, that little circle on the left side, is an example of what these tiny little algae look like under the microscope. And so I count a lot of these cells to try to understand how a coral is doing. So trying to count how many cells might be inside that coral's tissue. And so what's really special about the corals, in addition to the plants and the algae giving them food, they're actually what also give the corals their beautiful colors. So some algae are different colors, and that's what makes the corals you see on a reef different colors and what makes them so beautiful. But unfortunately, some of you may have heard that some things aren't going so well for the coral reefs. So when water temperatures get too warm, this relationship between the algae and the coral breaks down, and the algae leaves the coral. And so at that point, the coral looks like it's turned white because the coral has a white skeleton underneath it. So when the algae leave, then all you can see through is that white skeleton. But it's important to remember that the coral is still alive at this point in time. It's just very, very sick. It's not able to get that nutrients it was relying on from its algae. And that's why we call it coral bleaching, because the coral looks like it turned white. So some corals can recover from this phenomenon. But before we get into that, I want to just highlight a little bit about the water temperatures across the coral reef. So this is where we're going to look at these data patterns. And what we're looking at here, you can see the darker colors have alert next to them instead of watch or warning. So just like you might have heard about storms here in the Midwest, a watch is where things might look like they're getting to not be so good. And a warning is things aren't looking good at all. And then we have those alert and those dark red patterns. And so you can see a lot of these red patterns are where coral reefs are. So those dark red colors mean that water temperatures are really, really warm for those corals, and they're probably not going to be doing very well. But I'm always hesitant to kind of share this message because it's really difficult for us as scientists. We want to share this concern with everyone, but we also don't want everyone to think there's no hope. You see all of this red on this globe, and it might be really hard being in Nebraska to care or think that there's something you can do about it because they're so far away. But I do want to share with you that there is hope because some corals can recover from bleaching events. So we're going to talk about a few ways that that can happen. So in this first photo on the top left, this is a picture of a swarm of food in the water for corals that they could eat. And so remember how we talked about the polyps, they can use their tentacles to reach out and grab some food from the water column. When the corals have bleached, some of them can actually increase that feeding behavior. Just like you, if you're tired, you might want to eat more to get more energy. So the corals can do the same thing to try to recover. In the second photo, they can switch their type of algae sometimes. So you can see in that top photo, some of the corals are trading out those yellow and blue algae for some black or brown algae, or trading out their red algae. So just like us, if we have something that a newer version comes out, or what we're using isn't working anymore, we might try to update to a new version. And some corals are able to do that with their algae. Some might be more heat tolerant and might not leave as quickly as the water temperature is slowly moving up, or they might have a better relationship with that coral. And then the last example, there's many examples, but the last one we're going to talk about at the bottom is large energy reserves. So just like if you eat a really big lunch, you might not be as hungry for dinner. And so some corals can actually store up energy from their meals to save it to be able to recover from a bleaching event. Because once the water temperature cools down again back to its regular temperature, then the algae can return to the coral and start that healthy relationship again. So we're going to dive just a little bit deeper into the feeding of corals, because you guys might be wondering, what are they actually eating? So a lot of what they're eating can be plankton. And what we call plankton is anything in the water that can't outswim the current. So it just moves along with the water wherever it takes it, and it can't really control too much where it's going. So most of these organisms are really, really tiny, and you can't really see them unless you are using a microscope. There are some bigger ones, like jellyfish are also plankton, and we can see those. But the most common type of zooplankton, which is an animal plankton, so you can think of it like a zoo has animals, so zooplankton or animal plankton, is the copepod, and that's on the left. And this is a photo under a microscope, so it's 1 millimeter. So there could be about 10 that I could fit on my fingernail. So they're very, very, very small. But the corals can eat these plankton, and this can be one of the ways that they can recover if they're able to catch them, because they can be pretty fast. But unfortunately, not all corals are able to use all recovery mechanisms. So one coral might be able to increase its feeding behavior, but another one might not be able to. And so there's a lot more for scientists to learn about how some corals recover in certain situations when others don't. And then I just wanted to share with you, this is a 3D model of a coral that I made. So this is one of the tools that I used to do some of my research and get some of the data that I needed, was bringing the corals into the lab and taking photos of them and using some software to stitch together the photos to create this 3D model of a coral. And I thought it might be cool for you guys to see it, so you can kind of see all the sides of what a piece of coral looks like, and kind of see some of the tools that we use to study them in the lab. So you can see there's a white base that we're attaching the coral to, so we can identify them when we're taking our measurements and know that the measurements I took for this coral along the way is always associated with this coral. So what I really want you to take away from today is that coral bleaching is not always a death sentence. Coral bleaching is not good for corals, and we want to do all we can to protect them, because coral reefs are really important ecosystems. They provide a lot to the communities around them, from protection from big storms, to being a food source, to in normal times, having people travel and bringing money and supporting their community and the economy. So coral reefs are really important, but we do know that they're in danger. So it's really important for us to understand all that we can about them. And while the outlook for corals is not great, there is still hope that coral reefs, they're not going to look the same as they did before, but they might still be able to continue and just look a little differently in the future. But for this to happen, we all need to play our part, even in Nebraska. So you can help to keep the water temperatures from rising by reducing our energy use and reducing what we call our carbon footprint. So some of these examples are walking or biking somewhere if it's safe instead of driving, or turning the heat or air conditioning down or up a few degrees, or other things that might fit your lifestyle. It's different for everyone, but there are little things that each of us can do, and they do really add up. So now I've been talking for a while, so I have another question for you guys. So now we're going to kind of transition into, we've talked about bleaching, which is a big threat to coral reefs, but I wondered if you guys know what else might be stressing coral reefs. So bleaching is a big problem, but there's all kinds of little problems that are impacting coral reefs too. And so if we can help protect some of these smaller problems, then that gives the corals a better chance to be able to recover from the bigger bleaching problems. So you can go ahead and I'll go to the next poll. And you guys can type in what else you think might be stressing coral reefs. You can only put in one word at a time, I just learned. So if you want to put a 2-word phrase in, just don't put a space in between it. But I'll give you guys some time to think about what else it might be that could end up stressing corals in addition to warming waters causing bleaching. Okay, let's see what you guys were able to come up with. Oil spills, that's definitely a good one. That can be really stressful and really hard to clean up because we don't know when they're going to happen and we don't know exactly where that oil is going. And so it's really important that we're protecting our ocean and that environment. You're right, there's lots of different environmental stressors other than temperature that can impact coral reefs. But I'm really excited that people put trash dumping and plastic pollution because that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, because that is something that is really stressing coral reefs in addition to bleaching. And it's something that we can all play a role in as well, even in Nebraska, trying to help save the coral reefs. So if we go back to the slides, sorry, here we go. So here's an example of all of the danger that marine debris or trash can cause on coral reefs. So this is a coral colony that is just covered in things that humans have littered or lost, and now they're over the coral colony. So marine debris, we call marine debris anything that's persistent, solid material that's human-made and disposed of into the marine environment or Great Lakes. And so, for example, this coral can be really threatened because it's getting blocked from the sunlight, which is what's used to help the algae produce the energy and the food that the coral needs. It's blocking it from using its tentacles to reach out and grab food from the water column. And it also could be physically damaging the coral by becoming entangled or scraping it or being too heavy and breaking off different pieces of it. And so this is really dangerous for coral reefs, especially because a coral can't move away from the marine debris. But there's all different types of environments that can be threatened by marine debris in addition to coral reefs. So here's some examples of other ways that marine debris can harm animals is by, they might eat it. They might either eat it accidentally because they might think it looks like it's food source, and so they eat it on accident. Or they also might be eating it just while they're eating their actual food, because a lot of marine debris is plastic. Plastic can break down into really tiny pieces that we call microplastics. And sometimes microplastics can be so small that we can't see them without a microscope. And if you guys remember, we talked about something else just a little bit ago that we usually had to have a microscope to see, which was plankton. And that's what corals eat, and that's what a lot of other animals eat. So if we can't even tell the difference or see them in the water, it's really difficult for animals to make that distinction as well, or know that they're consuming them while they're eating their other food. Additionally, sometimes this marine debris makes an animal feel full because its stomach has all of that debris in there, but it didn't get any of the nutrients that it would get from its normal diet. So it can disrupt its digestive system. And then animals can also get entangled in it, just like corals. Animals that move might be more threatened by entanglement as well if they're used to being able to move to find food, and then they can't move and they might really hurt themselves trying to get untangled. So I want to ask you guys, how do you think that marine debris actually gets into these environments? So I'll go ahead and start the next poll, and you guys can type your answers in here of how would marine debris, the things that we produce that we're not using anymore, how might that get into the environment? It can be a coral reef, or it could be a different environment that you might be thinking of as well. Okay, let's see if that's enough time to get some answers in. And yes, so exactly, so dumping or illegal dumping, and boats that are in the environment, and then humans, exactly, it's us. These are things that we created and we're using, and then they end up in the ocean. And I really like that there's dumping and illegal dumping, because that's exactly my next point that I want to make, is to show that sometimes it might be intentional that someone might purposefully just litter something on the ground because there's not a trash can nearby. But they also might try to do the right thing and put it in a trash can, but sometimes the trash cans get really full. And so even if you do the right thing of putting something in the trash can, it still might blow away and it can still end up in the environment. And even if that happens in Nebraska, you might think there's no way it could ever reach the ocean. But actually, what can happen is when trash is being blown away and it ends up in the streets, it can get washed down into the storm drain, and it will go into the Missouri River. And then the Missouri River goes to the Gulf of Mexico. And then it's in the ocean. But it might not even stay in the Gulf of Mexico. It could end up somewhere else in the ocean. So that's why it's really important for all of us to be careful about what we're doing with the things that we use and we produce and how we dispose of them, because we want to try really hard to not let it get into the environment. So we're going to watch a quick video about how marine debris can move across the ocean. And there are, sometimes the video is talking about buoys, which are tools that are used to take measurements across the ocean. And sometimes they're talking about particles in a model. But really, when you're seeing little dots on the screen, you can just imagine them as marine debris, because we're using this video to look at how things move across the ocean. They start in one place and they can end up somewhere totally different. And then we'll see how this movement creates what Daphne referred to earlier about the garbage patches, where there's a lot of marine debris in certain places in the ocean.
Hey, it's Greg Shirer from NASA's Scientific Visualization Studio. We wanted to see if we could visualize the so-called ocean garbage patches. We start with data from floating scientific buoys that NOAA has been distributing in the oceans for the last 35 years, represented here as white dots. Let's speed up time to see where the buoys go. Since new buoys are continually released, it's hard to tell where older buoys move to. Let's clear the map and add the starting locations of all the buoys. Interesting patterns appear all over the place. Lines of buoys are due to ships and planes that released buoys periodically. If we let all the buoys go at the same time, we can observe buoy migration patterns. The number of buoys decreases because some buoys don't last as long as others. The buoys migrate to 5 known gyres, also called ocean garbage patches. We can also see this in a computational model of ocean currents called ECHO2. We release particles evenly around the world and let the modeled currents carry the particles. The particles from the model also migrate to the garbage patches. Even though the retimed buoys and modeled particles did not react to currents at the same times, the fact that the data tend to accumulate in the same regions shows how robust the result is.
So my next question for you guys, after looking at that video, is where can you find marine debris in the ocean? So we already kind of looked at on the map and on the globe where you might find those garbage patches, but I'm kind of thinking more of where can you find it if you're in the ocean? Do you think that it's all at the top, at the surface of the ocean, or is it in the middle of the ocean, floating around where the animals might be swimming? Or do you think it's going to be on the bottom of the ocean? So we can go back to our poll, and I'll give you a chance to type in some answers of where you might be able to find marine debris. And that's what we call the water column. So if you were looking at the ocean like straight on and you have this column, is it in the top, at the surface, or the middle, or the bottom? Okay, let's see if that was enough time to get some answers. So top and bottom, middle, floating, and all areas. So this is great. We covered everything, and that's exactly right, because we saw there's all different kinds of debris, and they all have different patterns and fates of where they end up. There are some things that are floating that you can see at the surface, and those might accumulate. But when we talk about a garbage patch, we're not necessarily talking about islands that are building up and up. We might definitely see things together at the surface, but whatever we see at the surface, we know there's more that could be floating down, from those plastics that are breaking up in small pieces floating down, to really heavy things like tires that might just right away sink down to the bottom of the ocean. So my next question is following up from this. If we know that marine debris can be found in all areas of the ocean, where or what are some tools that you guys think we might be able to use to remove marine debris from the ocean? We might not be able to get this going. But if we're not able to, I don't know if you guys are able to submit answers for that one. It looks like it might have stopped working. But you guys can think about it, because the answer really is for the tools that can be used to remove marine debris from the water. There's definitely a lot of ideas out there. But what you guys probably realized is there's probably not one answer that can remove it from all the different places that we talked about. And so that's why it is important for you guys, for anyone, to think about creative ideas about how we can try to clean up the environment, because we want to get as much of that out of there as possible. But what we really want to try and think about is, since we as humans are really the source of this problem of marine debris, that really means that we are the solution. And so you want to do what you can to stop the marine debris from getting into the ocean, to have to find a way to clean it up in the first place. So that might be picking up trash if you see it, so that it can't get washed down a storm drain or blown away somewhere. But it's also thinking about prevention from the source. So if you were going to walk into your kitchen and the sink was overflowing, would you go grab buckets and towels, or would you turn off the sink first? So hopefully we would all be able to turn off the sink, and that's what we really want to do with marine debris. So we want to think about ways that we can even not have that piece of debris in our hand and have to decide what's the best way to dispose of it, but what are some things that we might be able to use instead that we wouldn't need to dispose of so quickly. So this can be a really hard journey to do to make these changes, because we can't just all stop producing waste. It's not possible right now, but there are little things that we can all do. So I listed a few things that I try to do, which is I have a nice Nebraska reusable water bottle that I try to have with me. I bring utensils with me so I don't have to try to use plastic utensils if I'm getting takeout. We can have reusable bags. And one really cool thing that you can do is if you don't have a reusable bag, you can actually make one out of a t-shirt. So this was an old t-shirt that I have, and you just cut the collar off and you cut the sleeves off, and then you just tie the bottoms together. You cut fringes just like you would do a blanket, and you can take this to the grocery store with you, something that you have in your closet right now. Or there's other things you can try and use, like straws, or opt not to use a straw. Try to bring your food in a container that you already have. So those are just some examples, and you can't do them all at once, but just taking it step by step can be really helpful. And once you start taking these small steps, then maybe you can try some bigger steps a little later down the road of trying to buy things that have less plastic packaging, or buy things in bulk so you don't have to buy them as often. And then it's just really important to share this information with others. Tell other people what you learned today and what your reactions are, because that's really how it starts, is seeing other people doing it, and maybe they can think they can do it too. So it might be talking about it or visualizing it. This is an example of storm drain art to try to remind people not to litter so their trash doesn't go down the storm drain. All different kinds of things that you can do. So I'm really excited. I hope that you guys enjoyed the presentation, and I'm excited to hear some of your questions.
Amanda, thank you so much for that presentation. It was awesome. Learned so much. So the students of Do School were able to write down some questions, and I have those for you. The first question from Taylor from Howard Kennedy Elementary is, have you ever seen an octopus?
Oh, I love that question. So yes, I have been lucky enough to see an octopus. If you remember that first photo I showed of my first dive, when we were going on our first night dive, I said to my dive buddy, I know we're probably not going to see an octopus because they're camouflage and they're hard to find, but I'm going to be really sad if we don't see one. And we did, and it was really, really amazing. And so I have seen one, and I feel really lucky to have been able to.
Well, along those lines, we have Felicia, who goes to Howard Kennedy Elementary, and she asked, have you ever been trapped or hurt doing your job?
Ooh, that's also a good question. So I have not been trapped, but when I was learning to dive, when you're learning to dive, you have to practice, it's kind of a big word, but we call it buoyancy. So where you are in the water column. So you don't want to be floating up at the top because you want to be working, but you also don't want to be on the bottom because you don't want to be touching that coral reef environment. You want to be floating right above it. And so it takes some practice to get that skill down. And so there were a couple of times where I got a little tangled while I was figuring that out, but that's why you have a dive buddy. So there's always someone there who can help you figure out how to navigate what you're doing.
Wow. Isabella from the 7th grade at King Science says, how do you find injured sea animals like turtles or whales?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that kind of goes to the question that I don't have an exact answer for that for you, but there are a lot of organizations who specialize in that. I don't know how much of their time they actually spend going out and looking for animals as much as they're ready to respond right away when someone might have found them, and then they can call, and then those people are ready to go find those injured animals. I haven't come across any myself when I've been diving. But it can be really tricky because you don't know where those problems are going to occur. So that's a really good thing to think about and to realize that can be really hard to figure that out.
Well, Amanda, one of our teachers has a question. I don't know if you have an answer for this. She says, how many students would fit in a whale's mouth?
Oh, I don't have an answer for that one, but that's a good question. It would depend on which whale you were talking about. But even if you asked the specific whale, I wouldn't know the answer. But that's a good one that we can try and find the answer to on our own.
Hey, Linda from Howard Kennedy asked, did a shark or something else ever come at you?
Ooh, good question. So I've never been in a scary situation with a shark, but I have been diving around them. So luckily the reefs that I were in, the sharks are all very calm, not really dangerous sharks. They're just laying there watching, or they swim by and you just stay there and they do their own thing. But I do get startled when I see them and I'm not expecting to see them. It's never been like they're swimming right at me, but if I see it out of the corner of my eye and I wasn't expecting it, even though I know it's not going to hurt me, it still makes me a little startled.
Well, we have another shark question. Ameliana from Howard Kennedy asked, have you ever fed a shark with your bare hands?
Ooh, I have not done that. I have not done any of that, like cage diving or specific interactions. If I see a shark, I just stay where I am and let it do its own thing, not interrupt it, because I'm in its home, right? So I don't want to disrupt what it's doing.
I have another question for you. This is from Rihanna. She's in the 7th grade at McMillan. She asked, do you believe in mermaids?
Ooh, interesting question. I don't believe in mermaids, but that's a fun question and fun things to think about. It's always good to have, charismatic images or fun images of things that when we're thinking about the ocean, what's going to make us care about it, or all of that. And while I don't personally believe in mermaids, there are a lot of things that exist in the ocean that I don't know, that no one knows that exists. There's a lot of the ocean that hasn't been explored. And so there's a lot for us left to learn.
I have another question for you. Ava is asking, is dive equipment heavy?
Ooh, that's a great question. So yes, dive equipment is heavy. It makes it even heavier because sometimes that equipment is actual weight. So when I was talking about, you want to find that spot when you're diving where you're not on the bottom, you're not rising to the top. And so a lot of times, well, all of the time, I have to put on weights. So they sit, I can either, sometimes we use a weight belt and we string the weights and put it around our waist, or we have devices that we can change the amount of air that is in there. So that's what helps us get to that right place. So you can add more air or less air to help figure out where you are in the water column in that device. It's just like that vest that's on top of the tank. And so we can insert weights into the pockets of that vest, but that makes it really heavy. And then the tanks that you saw, that's the oxygen that we breathe. So we connect our gear to those tanks, and those tanks are heavy. So a lot of times we use like a wheelbarrow to put all of our gear in to carry it to the site that we need to. And you try to get it as close as you can where the waves aren't going to come bother it while you're underwater, but you don't have to carry all that gear by hand too far. So that can be why it's tricky. Some places people don't dive in because it's really hard to access it.
Fantastic. We just have a couple more questions. We thank you so much for answering all these questions.
Of course.
So Cody from Minnelusa wants to know, what's your favorite fish?
Ooh, favorite fish. That's a good question. Ooh, I don't know if I have just one favorite, but I do really like pufferfish. So those fish, when they get scared, they're really small. And then when they're scared, they puff up to scare off what's scaring them. I think that's really cool.
Hey, Amanda, what's the favorite part of your job and the not favorite part of your job?
Ooh, good question. So since I mostly talked about my research, I'll talk about my favorite part of research, which probably was diving and getting to be underwater. So a lot of my time running my experiments, I was actually underwater conducting work. So that was really cool. But then when I came back from the work, I had to look at all of those little copepods that we talked about and all those little zooplankton and count them under the microscope. And it was fun at first to see all the different shapes and critters that are there. But I spent a lot of time on the microscope, and I think that probably became at least one of my least favorite parts by the end of it.
Well, Amanda, we've come to our last question. This is from Hannah, who goes to King Science, and she wants to know, have you ever found a ship?
Ooh, good question.
What oceans have you explored? Have you ever found a ship, and what oceans have you explored?
Okay, good question. So I haven't found a ship that no one else has found before, but I have done some dives where we purposefully went where people knew there was a ship, and we went to dive there, which is really interesting because there's a lot of interesting life to see in those ships because it provides a brand new habitat for a lot of animals. And so it can be really fun to see what's either growing there that might be stationary, or to see, you know, what shark might have found its home there, or other animals. So you usually do those dives at night, and you see the animals that come out at night. So that can be really fun. And then most of my diving has all been in the Caribbean. So kind of in those maps that I showed, that's where I've done most of my diving. I did dive in the Pacific Ocean, just on the other side of Panama, so not too far. And then, so that's where I've spent most of my time. I haven't gotten to go to Australia to see the Great Barrier Reef yet, but yeah, that's where I spent most of my time.
Fantastic. Okay, I have one more question that just came up in our chat. Do you swim to where you dive, or do you get lowered down?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So there's lots of ways that you can actually get into the water. So when I'm diving in Panama, most of the time I'm diving off of a boat. So there's a few different ways that you get in the water. If you're on a big enough boat, you can put all your gear on and you can just step right off. You take a really big step, a giant stride, and then you just plop right into the ocean. I don't like to do that. That's not my style. So I either get all my gear on and then I sit on the edge of the boat and then roll back or lower in depending on the conditions. Or if you're lucky enough, you can have a buddy or a boat driver who might help you. And so you might just get into the water normally if you were just going to go swimming, and then someone hands you your gear, and then you just put on the vest that already has the tank attached, and then you're ready to go. Sometimes you're diving from the shore, so you can just get your gear on the beach and just walk right into the ocean. But there are other places, just as you mentioned, where you might actually get lowered, take something similar to an elevator to get, because it's hard to access, and that's how you get into the ocean. I haven't personally done that, but I know quite a few people who have.
Yeah, that sounds like the part of being a marine scientist that I would not enjoy. So, but everything else sounds awesome.
Yes, getting into the water can be tricky. I got used to it, but definitely the first more than a few times, it's scary, but it was worth it.
Amanda Dwyer, marine scientist right here from Ralston, Nebraska, currently in Maryland. Just want to give a heartfelt thank you for joining us today. The students at Do School, thank you. All students, thank you. And we really appreciate taking some time to enlighten us on what you do and also on some of the challenges in your field. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad for all of you who took the time to join today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Right, and if you want to know about other programming that we have, you can go to mccneb.edu for other programming, all things science and STEM related. Thank you for joining us today.